confused as to which side to believe. And he adds that at the very beginning of his article, or of his entry, but almost immediately realizes what's going on. He receives a telegram from Mrs. Stern, the mother of his school friend, asking him to come to Würzburg as soon as possible. One can easily assume that he recognized the significance of what was going on as soon as he received the telegram, because he does two things. The first thing is that Robert writes throughout his train ride to Würzburg. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to read the top half of this entry because I know that you can't read it. So here I am on the outskirts of Frankfurt, sitting in a train and bound for Würzburg, where I know not what awaits me. From Marburg till now, I've been deliberately perusing a Saturday Evening Post in an effort to alienate my mind at once from the matter at hand. The effort has not been particularly successful, naturally enough, and has served only to make starker the grim situation here, for I have no doubts that grim it will be. This might be classified under adventure, but an adventure arising from such despicable, horrible, and inhuman sources. America, the land of the free, still has much meaning, I think. Once Robert arrived in Würzburg, he finds Mrs. Stern in her ransacked home, Dr. Stern having been arrested and sent to a concentration camp. The second thing that Harlan does that shows us that he recognizes the significance of this is for the only time in his diary, he switches out of cursive into printed handwriting, making it much easier to read. He writes, Saturday a.m., Fraulein's dumb terror and ensuing exhausted relief at seeing me. Momentary breakdown by both women, apartment's appearance, little left in peace, doors smashed, furniture splintered to nothing, pictures methodically mutilated, books scattered all over, clocks turned over. For many Jews living under Nazi rule, Kristallnacht was a culmination of all the persecutions that came before. It was the final moment in which many German Jews realized that this was not all going to subside with time, and the Jews were no longer going to be allowed to participate in German life. For the Sterns, who were already hoping to come to the United States to join their son, Kristallnacht was the event that made this hope into a necessity. Robert visited the American consulate in Stuttgart on behalf of the Sterns. Dr. Stern was released from the concentration camp since he had fought for Germany in World War I, and the Sterns were able to travel first to England and then to the United States. This is a post-war photo of Robert with the Sterns. It's doubtful that Robert's visit to the consulate had any true influence in getting him out of Germany, but the Sterns were very, very lucky. Robert's perspective in his diary entries is very narrow, and what he experienced was limited. That's true of every story. It's true of Helen Baker, it's true of Carl Sewell, it's true of Robert Harlan, it's true of all of our experiences as well. We and they are limited to what we experience and what we know. And all of these artifacts, these diaries, these experiences then build to a scholarly narrative of the event. This is what historians use when they're trying to figure out what happens. To that end, I'd like to thank you all and invite my colleague, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Senior Historian Peter Black, to come and give a scholarly narrative of Kristallnacht.
I actually did that, believe it or not. First of all, thank you, Becky, for introducing me, and also thank you very much to Professor Manaz-Afridi and all the folks here at the Holocaust Genocide Center here in Manhattan College, who made it possible for Becky and I to have the honor to speak with you tonight. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming out on what turned out to be a beautiful November night, a Monday night football night as well, to listen to us talk on such a sober topic. On the night of November 10th, 1938, Wednesday night will make it 83 years ago, Members of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, and its paramilitary formations engaged in a nationwide, state-sponsored, coordinated assault on Jewish persons, property owned by Jews, and on the vestiges of Jewish economic life that had survived 5.5 years of Nazi discrimination and persecution. Conducted on a public stage, the destruction was extensive. The local Nazi Party leaders instigated the violence, either upon receipt of or in anticipation of instructions from above. Ordinary citizens joined in at some locations. Other citizens watched, with or without sympathy, for the victims of the carnage. A minority of bystanders tried to help the victims, or even to stand up to the Nazi goons. But the outside world greeted the violence with outrage, but without immediately visible response. And as you can see in the first 2 slides here, I hope you can read the headline. The interested American reader could certainly inform him or herself quite well, at least to the widely reported events in Germany, and not solely by reading the New York Times or the Washington Post. On that evening and the following day, perpetrators torched, desecrated, or otherwise destroyed at least 267 synagogues. A couple of examples here. They vandalized, looted, and destroyed over 7,500 shops and businesses owned by Jews. A photograph of the Schwarz restaurant in Munich. They trashed at least 177 private homes in which Jews resided. Onlookers dubbed the violence the Night of Crystal, or Kristallnacht, in reference to the millions of shards of glass littering city and town streets, mute remnants of tens of thousands of glass windows. Insurance companies estimated the total damage in glass alone at 6 million Reichsmark, or 2.4 million US dollars in 1938 currency. Roughly half the total income of the entire Belgian glass industry, which was deployed to replace the glass. Total damages were estimated at 1 billion Reichsmark, or $400 million US in 1938 currency. At a time before the Holocaust itself threatened to render it insignificant, the state-sponsored assault on human beings shocked and sickened observers. The perpetrators murdered at least 91 persons, a figure that an unknown number of suicides augmented. To offer an example of the heartless brutality of these killings, let me read to you from the testimony of one of the murderers during an interrogation 1 year later. At 8 a.m. on November 10, 1938, several members of the Nazi Party assault detachments, in German Sturmabteilungen, better known by their acronym, the SA, or SA, broke into the home of 81-year-old Susanne Stern in Eberstadt, near Heilbronn, in the state of Württemberg. Commanded by Adolf Frey, the SA men ordered Stern to dress and accompany them. Showing tremendous courage, the old woman refused. She planted herself on her sofa and told the SA thugs that she did not care what they did. Frey then drew his pistol, and as he recalled under interrogation a year later, and I quote now, shot Stern through the chest. At the first shot, Stern collapsed on the sofa. She leaned backward and put her hands on her chest. I immediately fired the second shot, this time aiming at the head. Stern fell from the sofa and turned. She was lying close to the sofa with her head turned to the left, toward the window. At that moment, Stern still gave signs of life. From time to time, she gave a rattle and stopped. Stern did not shout or speak. My comrade turned to see to Stern's head to see where she had been hit. I told him that I didn't see why we should be standing around. The right thing to do was to lock the door and surrender the keys. But to be sure that Stern was dead, I shot her in the middle of the brow from a distance of approximately 10 centimeters. Despite this admission and the resulting indictment for murder, the German Ministry of Justice quashed the investigation in a decision of October 1st, 1940. In the first mass arrest operation directed against Jews simply because they were Jews, German police rounded up around 30,000 Jewish men, most of them well-to-do, and marched them to train stations in full view of non-Jewish civilian onlookers. At the orders of the security police, uniformed police officials transferred the prisoners to Dachau, 10,911 prisoners, Buchenwald, 9,815 prisoners, and Sachsenhausen, 9,000 prisoners. In this slide, you see a roll call at the Buchenwald concentration camp, where the new arrivals had to stand at attention. Subjected to humiliating, exhausting calisthenics, back-breaking, meaningless manual labor to which they were not accustomed, and to frequent arbitrary beating and physical abuse, hundreds of Jews died in the camps in the following weeks. In Buchenwald alone, 231 Jews had died by January 1939. German authorities estimated that more than 1,000 Jewish concentration camp prisoners died during that winter. German authorities released the remainder on the condition that they emigrate, often within days or weeks, leaving their property and assets behind. To add insult to injury, the German government imposed upon the Jewish communities a fine of 1 billion Reichsmark to pay for damages and cleanup after Kristallnacht. Jewish community leaders had to raise the funds from increasingly impoverished members. The pretext for Kristallnacht was the despairing act of an emotionally disturbed teenager named Herschel Grünspan. On November 7th, 1938, shortly after 9:30 a.m., Grünspan gunned down Ernst von Rath, the third secretary at the consulate of the German embassy in Paris. Grünspan's act was motivated by the deportation of his family to the German-Polish border. The boy was the son of a Polish-Jewish tailor named Sendel Grünspan, who had emigrated from Tsarist Russia to Hanover, Germany in 1911. Although Zendel had accepted the offer of Polish citizenship when his hometown was incorporated into the reconstructed Polish state in 1918, the Grünspan family had resided in Hanover for over a generation, when in 1938 the German government stepped up its efforts to forcibly expel Jews residing in Germany. Expulsion of Austrian Jews to Switzerland induced the Swiss authorities to demand that the passports of Jews bear a special identifying marker. The German government obliged in August 1938, requiring Jews bearing German passports to have a special J inserted to identify them as Jews. In mid-October 1938, German occupiers of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia forcibly pushed many Sudeten Jews over the new border with the rump Czechoslovak Republic. In March 1938, the Polish government issued a decree canceling the citizenship of all nationals who had resided abroad continuously for at least 5 years and who had failed to report for military service. According to census data, in June 1933, nearly 100,000 foreign Jews resided in Germany. More than half, over 56,000, were citizens of Poland. On October 6, 1938, the Polish Ministry of the Interior announced that Polish legations would review the passports of citizens living abroad to determine whether or not they remained valid in accordance with the March decree. In response, the German security police rounded up some 17,000 identified Jewish residents born in Poland, whether Polish citizens or stateless, shipped 12,000 of them, including 2,000 children, to the border and expelled them from the country. German police authorities carried out the deportations brutally, concentrating targeted Jews in the cities and transporting them on the night of October 27, 28, 1938 by closed freight car to the border. In increasingly bitter cold, border officials physically drove the Jews on foot across the frontier onto Polish territory. Polish authorities admitted 4,000 of the refugees, but refused entry to the other 8,000, who wandered back and forth across the border without food or shelter. As the former Mannheim resident Otto Buchholz wrote 6 weeks later from a refugee camp in Zabolshin, and I quote, "It was a picture of cruelty, crying women and children, heartrending scenes. Then we were transported to the border in closed rail cars under close police guard. Midday Saturday, having arrived at the border at 5 a.m., we were pushed over the border. Here we saw a new gruesome picture of terror. For 3 days we were on the platform and in the train station, 8,000 people. Women and children, unconscious, crazed. Deaths, faces yellow like wax. A pure graveyard of corpses. I was also among the unconscious. Nothing but the dry prison bread, without anything to drink. Slept not at all. 2 nights on the platform. And one night in the train station where I collapsed. There was nowhere to stand. Contaminated air, women and children, half dead. On the 4th day, help finally came." Polish authorities eventually admitted virtually all of the deportees, including the Grunspan family, and settled them in a detention camp at Zabolshin. Zendo Grunspans testified many years later at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem regarding the forced mile march to the border. And I quote again here, "The SS came with whips and struck us. Those who could not walk were beaten. There was blood on the road. It was the first time that I had suffered German brutality. We were made to run and they shouted at us. I was struck and fell to the side of the road. There was a heavy rain. Some people sank to the ground. Some fainted. Others had heart attacks. There were many old people among us. We hadn't eaten since Thursday night. When we arrived at the Polish frontier, the Poles fired shots at us, not knowing who we were. Then a Polish general and some officers, astonished to see such a tremendous crowd, looked at our passports and found that we were Polish citizens. They decided then to let us enter. On Sunday, October 30th, 1938, the Poles gave us the first meal we had had since Thursday, end quote. Grunspan learned of his family's plight in a letter from his sister that he received in Paris, where he was attending boarding school, on November 3rd. He may not have known the specific details of the deportations, but he knew enough. He could draw the mental picture. And with this knowledge, with this image, he went out to buy a gun. Mortally wounded by Grunspan, von Roth died on the afternoon of November 9th, 1938. Hitler, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, and other top Nazi leaders had gathered in Munich for the anniversary celebration of the ill-fated Nazi beer hall putsch on November 8th. They had monitored von Roth's medical progress closely, having deliberated extensively on options for spinning the event, regardless of von Roth's fate. Hitler decisively ordered party leaders to send local formations into action against Jews and Jewish communities throughout the Third Reich. He ordered Goebbels to spin the violence as the spontaneous expression of a, quote, people's anger, end quote. The German word is Volkszorn, against the perceived international Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germany, reflected in Grunspan's deranged act. Given the concentration of Nazi party leaders in Munich for the celebration, it was a simple matter for regional leaders to inform local operatives by telephone to do what was expected. Violence predated Hitler's instructions by nearly 48 hours. On the evening of November 7th, 12 hours after Grunspan shot von Roth, the SI unit in Kassel, reinforced by an SS unit from nearby Arolsen, destroyed the Jewish-owned Café Heinemann, gutted the city's synagogue, and then fanned out to destroy Jewish-owned shops and dwellings. Incited by press coverage of the assassination attempt, violent action spread throughout the country that night and the following day, particularly in the smaller towns. Hitler's order, after von Roth's death, sparked or reinforced the violence. The police were informed as well. Security Police Chief Reinhard Heydrich gave instructions on the night of November 9th, 10th, that the police were not to intervene unless violence or arson endangered non-Jewish lives or property. SS General Heinrich Müller, the chief of the secret state police, better known by its acronym Gestapo, ordered the arrest of 30,000 Jews that night. Kristallnacht will be remembered for images like those that I've shown to you tonight. Images of broken glass, smoldering shells of synagogues, desecrated cemeteries, trashed businesses and dwellings, and grim-faced Jewish men being marched to train stations. Kristallnacht is also remembered for the real and perceived indifference with which the German people and the world at large looked on a brutal assault on a small and defenseless minority. We also remember this night as a harbinger, that is, we who have the benefit of hindsight, of genocide and mass murder. Finally, we remember the impact events had on individual German and Austrian Jews. Tens of thousands wasted little time after the November 1938 riots in making arrangements to emigrate. The United States became home to tens of thousands of these refugees, of whom hundreds, perhaps thousands, have overcome the pain and humiliation of such memories in order to inform us, in writing or through speaking, of their memory of that night, in the fervent hope that it will never happen again. Other elements contribute to the significance of Kristallnacht, developments that the public did not so readily see at the time, and of which the contemporary press did not so readily report. For Kristallnacht was both an end and a beginning. As an end, its violence and the legislative tsunami in its aftermath served as culmination of pre-war Nazi Jewish policy. The economic measures enacted by the Nazi regime following Kristallnacht completed the circle of legal and quasi-legal activity aimed at segregating Jews out of German society and eliminating economic opportunity for Jews. Since 1933, Nazi anti-Jewish legislation had followed prolonged periods of state-sponsored street violence. In the first months of 1933, and Becky referred to these events, Nazi anti-Jewish legislation had followed, intensive violence aimed primarily at activists on the political left, but including many German Jews, preceded passage of the so-called law to restore the professional civil service of April 7, 1933. This law removed Jews and other so-called subversives whose loyalty to the nation the Nazis professed to doubt from positions in the public sector. Hitler's announcement in September 1935 of the Nuremberg race laws, which determined whom anti-Jewish legislation would impact, followed nearly 4 months of heightened street violence, now aimed primarily at Jews. These laws defined Jews, deprived them of their German citizenship, forbade them to display the national flag, and banned marriages and criminalized sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. Beginning with brutal street violence in Vienna, following the Anschluss of Austria and Corporation of Austria on March 11, 13, 1938, sporadic but increasingly systematic violence swept across the nation, spreading from city to city, culminating in the ravages of Kristallnacht 8 months later. Again, Jews were the main, on Kristallnacht itself the only target, but also during 1938, German police conducted street roundups of so-called asocials, of repeat criminal offenders who had served their time, and of Roma, also known as gypsies, for indefinite incarceration in concentration camps. From 1933 until 1938, with the exception of the period of the Berlin Olympics of the summer of 1936, the regime encouraged private initiatives to exclude Jews from restaurants and other places of social gathering, as it expropriated Jewish businesses or pressured Jews to sell their businesses at below market prices. Legislative policy aimed at segregating Jews in Germany reminded contemporaries, and still reminds some of us today, of Jim Crow legislation in the United States, some of which was still being passed contemporaneous with the first German measures. Nevertheless, and Nazi pundits gleefully acknowledged U.S. legislative inspiration for German measures. Nevertheless, the intent of the German lawmakers was dramatically different. Segregation in the United States targeted an already segregated and persecuted minority. It aimed to negate responsibilities of Americans under the 14th Amendment by maintaining strict race boundaries and by preventing African American integration into white politics, society, and the job market.